Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, which is about one of the most forbidden legends in Japan. In tonight's episode, we are going to explore a few terrifying tales. And among them is a story so cursed that even whispering its name is considered dangerous. It has never been fully written down, only passed in fragments and fearful warnings. Some call it the most dangerous horror tale ever told, one that no one should dare to finish. They say that when the words of this story are spoken, listeners tremble, faint, or even lose their minds entirely. Others claim entire villages once collapsed into ruin after hearing it. In more recent times, there are whispers of a teacher who read it aloud to his students during a bus ride. Every single passenger collapsed into unconsciousness before the story was finished. When they woke, none could remember what they had heard, as if the memory had been stolen from their minds. This cursed tale is known as Goou, the cow's head. And tonight, we step dangerously close to its shadow. The story of Goou has always been more than just another ghost tale whispered in the dark. It sits apart, like a shadow that refuses to leave the room even when the lights come on. Tonight, the telling begins not in some ancient temple or ruined village, but in a far more familiar setting. The main character of this story is a teacher, someone trusted to guide and protect his students, someone who would never deliberately cause harm. And yet, on one long journey through the Japanese countryside, he made a decision that would mark his class forever. It was early summer when the school trip began. The bus moved along winding country roads, lined with rice fields, shimmering under the heat of the Sunday Ration. Children were restless, their chatter rising and falling like waves, eager for distraction as the hours passed. To keep them entertained, the teacher had prepared a stack of books and stories, simple ghost tales and strange legends gathered from dusty shelves. At first, the atmosphere was light, almost playful. The children laughed, teased one another, and leaned into the stories with wide-eyed curiosity. But among the papers he carried was one text different from the rest, a set of pages kept separate, wrapped and folded in an envelope that had no title. He had not planned to share it, not at first. The setting inside the bus was ordinary, almost comforting in its familiarity. The seats vibrated with the steady hum of the engine, curtains swayed gently in the windows, and sunlight poured in from above, cutting bright patterns across the floor. Yet in the corner of the teacher's bag, that sealed envelope seemed to radiate a strange weight, as though it pressed against the world around it. He remembered the warnings he had read, scattered in academic notes and obscure journals, about a story that was never meant to be written, a story told only in whispers, carried across generations by monks who feared what it could unleash. Still, curiosity is a powerful thing, and curiosity had brought that envelope onto the bus. As the miles stretched on, the lighter stories began to lose their effect. The children, boldened by their own laughter, started demanding something scarier, something that could truly unsettle them. The teacher hesitated, his fingers brushing against the sealed envelope as though testing the weight of his decision. His goal, after all, had only been to pass the time, to keep the students entertained. But the temptation grew stronger with every demand until he finally drew out the envelope and held it in his hand. The laughter around him dimmed, replaced by a sharp silence. Even the sound of the engine seemed to dull. Something in the air shifted, and, though none of the students could explain why, they sat straighter, more alert, their voices caught in their throats. The mood of the bus had changed. What had begun as a carefree journey through the countryside was suddenly thick with tension. The teacher's expression, calm but unreadable, gave no comfort. He cleared his throat, and though he had not yet spoken a single word from the pages, a strange chill ran down the spines of everyone present. Curtains stopped swaying, as if the wind itself had been cut away. Somewhere in the back row, a student whispered nervously, asking if this was really a good idea. The teacher offered no answer. Instead, he slowly unfolded the pages, the crisp sound echoing through the narrow aisle like a blade sliding free of its sheath. In that moment, the purpose of their journey seemed to vanish. The destination no longer mattered. The hours no longer mattered. What mattered was the story about to be told, a story none of them should have asked to hear. And though none of them could have known it, they were about to step into the shadow of a legend said to devour those foolish enough to listen. The cursed tale of Goou was about to begin. The bus rolled steadily onward, but inside the air had shifted. The pages the teacher now held looked ordinary, nothing more than ink on paper, yet the silence around them was unnatural. The children leaned forward in their seats, restless energy fading into a strange quiet. Something about the way the teacher unfolded the story felt wrong, as if they had already crossed into forbidden territory before a single word was read. He began carefully, his voice steady but lower than usual, almost as though he did not want anyone outside the bus to hear. At first, the story did not seem frightening. It spoke of a distant village, small and isolated, a place where people lived simple lives surrounded by fields and mountains. But the details were oddly vague, as though the place existed and yet did not exist. At the same time, the name of the village was never mentioned, nor were the faces of its people. It was described as though already fading into memory, a place that resisted being pinned down in reality. The first unusual thing was the reaction of the students themselves. Normally, they would have whispered to each other, exchanged nervous giggles, or tried to show they were not afraid. But now, they sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the teacher as if pulled by invisible strings. A boy in the second row rubbed his arms, though the sun still poured through the bus windows. Another girl blinked too often, her mouth parting slightly as if she were about to interrupt, but no sound came. A tension none of them could name was beginning to root itself deep inside the bus. As the story moved forward, describing a harvest festival in the village, one of the younger children suddenly gasped. All heads turned toward her. She shook her head quickly and muttered that nothing was wrong, but her hands clutched tightly at her knees, knuckles turning white. The teacher faltered for only a second before continuing, though his brow furrowed faintly, betraying a flicker of doubt. The words on the page felt heavy in his mouth, as though each sentence demanded more strength than the one before it. Outside, the scenery of the countryside began to change. The bright summer fields gave way to thick clusters of trees. Their branches knotted and dark, casting heavy shadows across the road. It should have been nothing unusual. Japan's countryside was full of such forests, but several students later swore that the world beyond the windows seemed dimmer, as if the light had been drained from it. The driver kept his eyes locked on the road, his expression tense, his jaw rigid. Though no one asked him at the time, some believed he too felt something closing in around the bus. The first undeniable sign of strangeness came midway through the reading. A boy sitting near the back suddenly slumped forward, his head hitting the seat in front of him with a dull thud. Gasps rippled through the bus, and two students called his name in panic. The teacher stopped reading, rushing over to check. The boy was pale, his breathing shallow, but he quickly stirred, blinking in confusion. "I don't remember," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What were you saying?" His words unsettled the others, but the teacher tried to calm them, insisting the boy had simply dozed off. Yet the boy shook his head again and again, as though denying something only he could feel. When the teacher returned to his seat, the mood of the bus was no longer merely uneasy. It had shifted into something heavier, more oppressive. The children did not laugh or protest anymore. They only waited. The teacher hesitated, glancing down at the pages in his lap. For a brief moment he considered stopping, but curiosity and perhaps something darker urged him on. He read again. The tale now described the sudden appearance of a grotesque figure in the village, a stranger whose head resembled that of a decaying cow. Its eyes were said to glow faintly, its jaw twisted into something that was neither fully beast nor fully human. The villagers in the story fled in terror, yet the text described them in vague, unsettling fragments, as if the memory of their fear had been blurred. The students shifted uneasily in their seats, one boy covering his ears, another chewing nervously at his sleeve. And then another strange event occurred. The engine of the bus gave a sharp cough, the sound echoing unnaturally loud inside the small cabin. The driver swore under his breath, hands tightening on the wheel. The vehicle did not stop, but the steady hum that had accompanied them for hours now felt jagged, broken, as though something unseen had reached out to disturb it. The teacher paused, looking back at the driver, who only shook his head quickly, urging him to continue reading as though stopping would be the greater danger. From the front of the bus came a quiet thud, like someone had knocked on the exterior just beneath the windshield. Several students jumped, their eyes darting to the windows, but there was nothing to be seen except the dark blur of trees rushing past. A few whispered nervously, asking if it had been an animal on the road, but the sound had been too deliberate, too precise, like a fist-meeting glass. By now, the children were no longer leaning forward in curiosity. They were leaning back, pressing themselves into their seats, their bodies tensed as though waiting for something to burst through the narrow aisle. The teacher's voice grew slower, heavier, each word sinking into the air like a stone into water. None of them could explain why they kept listening. They only knew that they could not look away, could not close their ears, could not resist the pull of the story. And so, the first complication revealed itself clearly. This was not just another ghost tale to pass the time. Something about the act of telling it was changing the space inside the bus, bending it, dragging them closer to a place they had no wish to see. The teacher, too, began to realize he might have gone too far, but with the pages already open before him, it felt impossible to stop. The cursed story of Goou had already taken hold, and the first signs of its grip were beginning to show. The bus seemed to drift deeper into silence with every word spoken. What had once been the ordinary rhythm of a school trip now felt like something else entirely, as though they were no longer simply passengers on a road but captives inside a story that refused to let them go. The teacher's voice carried through the narrow space like an echo, steady but strained, each syllable hanging in the air far longer than it should have. The first faint signs of strangeness had unsettled the children, but what followed began to gnaw at the edges of reality itself. It started with the boy in the second row. He had been quiet since the story began, eyes glazed as though fixed on something beyond the windows. Now he slowly raised his hand, not to ask a question, but to point at the glass beside him. His classmates followed his gaze, and several gasped. The forest outside was wrong. The trees no longer seemed to move past in a blur of motion, but instead hung in place, motionless, as though the bus itself was the thing being dragged. A trick of the light, perhaps. Yet when the teacher faltered, staring out himself, the boy whispered, "It's watching us." Before the teacher could respond, another voice broke the silence, this time from the back of the bus, A girl who had been slumped against her seat sat bolt upright, her face pale and eyes wide. "Stop reading," she said sharply. "You have to stop now." It wasn't the timid whimper of a scared child. It was firm, commanding. A tone that felt far too old for her young age. The class turned toward her in surprise, waiting for the teacher to scold her. But he did not. For a long moment, his eyes lingered on her face, as though some part of him feared she might be right. Yet instead of closing the envelope, he pressed forward. His voice shook slightly, betraying nerves, but he did not stop. This defiance only deepened the unease. The girl clenched her fists on her lap, muttering under her breath as though trying to drown out the sound of the words. Those sitting nearest to her swore later that her whispers were not random, but fragments of a prayer. No one had ever taught her those words, yet they seemed to flow from her with desperate urgency. The conflicting presence between her warning and the teacher's insistence split the bus into two silent camps, those too terrified to continue, and those too entranced to look away. The second strange event came quickly. As the teacher read of villagers collapsing in fits of madness at the sight of the cow-headed figure, one of the lights above the aisle flickered and burst, showering sparks across the narrow walkway. The children screamed, some ducking down into their seats, others clutching at one another in panic. The driver cursed again, struggling to keep the bus steady as it lurched on the road. For a breathless moment, it seemed like the vehicle would stall, but somehow the engine roared back to life. Yet the light above remained shattered, leaving the center of the bus dim, shadow pooling unnaturally thick in the aisle. The teacher hesitated again, pages trembling slightly in his hands. The sensible choice would have been to stop, to laugh it off as coincidence, and tuck the cursed story back into his bag. But the words on the page seemed to hold him, pulling him deeper with invisible strings. The children noticed it too, that his voice was no longer fully his own. There was a cadence in his reading that didn't sound like him anymore, like something was whispering through him rather than from him. The girl who had given the warning now stood in the aisle. "If you don't stop," she said, her voice stronger than ever, "something will come inside." Her words chilled them all, and some students begged the teacher to listen. But he shook his head, muttering that it was only a story, that they were being carried away by fear. And so he continued, even as the bus grew colder and the trees outside seemed impossibly still. Then came the clue, subtle at first. In the story, the villagers described the cow-headed figure as appearing wherever fear was greatest, feeding not on flesh, but on terror itself. The more they tried to deny its presence, the stronger it became. As those words left the teacher's mouth, several students realized their own fear was only feeding whatever was happening. They tried to hold their breath, to sit rigid and silent, but the fear was impossible to hide. From the back of the bus came a faint scraping, like hooves dragging against the metal floor. Every head turned, but there was nothing. There were only shadows stretching far too long for the confined space. One boy whispered that he saw a shape, hunched and broad, moving just out of sight. Another swore the sound had come from beneath them, as if something was crawling along the underside of the bus, keeping pace. The tension had stacked itself high now, layer upon layer, but no answers had come. Only questions, only fear, only the sense that the story was no longer confined to the page, but spilling into the real world around them. The girl in the aisle squeezed her eyes shut and repeated her warning again. "Stop! Please, stop!" But the teacher, trapped between disbelief and obsession, pressed on. And with each word he spoke, it felt less like the bus was carrying its passengers toward their destination, and more like it was carrying them straight into the mouth of the legend itself. The bus shuddered, as if something heavy had landed on its roof, though the road was clear and the sky above was empty. The children screamed, ducking into their seats, while the driver swore and fought to steady the wheel. For a moment, the bus wobbled dangerously, the sound of metal groaning against its own frame echoing through the cabin. The teacher froze mid-sentence, the words caught in his throat. The pages in his hands fluttered as though stirred by a wind that no one else could feel. Then it came again, a dragging scrape, this time along the side of the bus, like hooves raking the metal, slow and deliberate, as if something outside was circling them. A few brave students craned their necks to peer out the windows, but all they saw was the blur of dark trees, impossibly still in their passing. No animals, no shapes, nothing. Yet the sound continued, low and grinding, until it stopped abruptly beneath the floor. The teacher's voice returned, shakier now, but the moment he tried to continue the story, several children cried out for him to stop. The girl in the aisle shouted above the others, her face pale but fierce. "It's here! Don't you see? You're letting it inside." Her words struck something deep, though none of them could explain why they believed her. Still, the teacher insisted it was just fear, just imagination feeding on coincidence. Yet his own hands trembled so violently that the edges of the paper tore beneath his grip. The bus grew colder. Breath began to mist in the air, faint white plumes that had no place in the heat of summer. The driver's rear-view mirror caught a flash of movement at the very back of the bus, though when he looked again, there was only darkness stretching between the rows of seats. He shouted for calm, but his own voice cracked with terror. And then it happened. A sound rose from the shadows at the back, low, guttural, and wet, like the groan of some enormous beast straining against its own body. It rolled forward through the bus, vibrating in the bones of everyone who heard it. A few students clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside their skulls as much as outside. A boy near the back suddenly fell from his seat, convulsing on the floor, foam at the corners of his mouth. Two classmates tried to help him, but the instant they touched him, they too fell, bodies twisting as if seized by invisible hands. The teacher dropped the pages at last, his face pale, eyes wide. "This isn't possible," he muttered over and over, backing away from the fallen students. The girl who had warned him knelt quickly, pressing her palms over her ears and urging the others to do the same. Some followed, desperate for any protection, while others sat frozen in terror, unable to move. From the floor beneath the convulsing children came a new sound, a heavy, rhythmic thud, like hooves striking wood. Slowly, it grew louder, each strike rattling the metal frame of the bus. The air filled with the stench of rot, sour and overpowering, like spoiled meat left too long in the Sunday. Students gagged and covered, their faces, tears running down their cheeks from the stinging odor, and then, through the haze of panic, this shape appeared. At the very back of the bus, just beyond the reach of the broken light, something rose from the floor. It was enormous, its body hunched, its shoulders broad. A head loomed above the seats, massive and grotesque, the unmistakable skull of a cow twisted into something half-human. Empty sockets burned faintly with a dull glow, casting long shadows across the ceiling. Its jaw sagged unnaturally, as though broken. Yet when it opened its mouth, the guttural groan returned louder now, so loud the windows shivered in their frames. The children screamed. The driver slammed on the brakes, the bus screeching as it skidded to the side of the road. Yet even as it lurched to a stop, the figure remained, swaying with the motion but never stumbling, its presence fixed, as though it had always been there. The teacher collapsed into his seat, clutching his head. "It's not supposed to be real," he whispered. "It's just a story. Just a story." But the truth was undeniable. The legend had come alive before their eyes. The girl in the aisle stepped forward, her entire body shaking, but her voice steady. "I told you. The story isn't read, it's summoned. You've brought it here." Her words cut through the chaos, reframing everything they had experienced. The silence of the forest, the slumping boy, the broken light, the scratching hooves, all of it had been signs, warnings of what was now standing among them. The figure leaned forward, its head lowering, the glow of its eyes sweeping across the rows of children. Wherever its gaze touched, students fainted, their bodies collapsing limply into their seats as if their very will had been drained. The smell grew stronger, suffocating, and the sound of hooves filled the air again, shaking the bus with every step it took forward. In that moment, the children no longer wondered whether the story was dangerous. They knew. The question now was whether any of them would leave that bus alive. And as the teacher stared into the glowing sockets of the cow's head, he finally understood this was no tale to entertain restless children. This was a curse, and they had invited it inside. The bus was no longer just a bus. It had become a cage, sealed off from the world outside, every window too dark to see through, every breath choked with the heavy stench of decay. The children cowered in their seats, some unconscious, others clinging to one another, their sobs swallowed by the guttural rumble of the creature now standing among them. Its grotesque cow's head swayed from side to side, empty sockets glowing faintly, and with each subtle movement the walls of reality seemed to ripple, as though the bus itself were sliding between two worlds. The teacher sat paralyzed, the cursed pages scattered at his feet, his mind unraveling. Everything he had read, the nameless village, the grotesque figure, the collapse of those who saw it, was no longer fiction. It was here, unfolding in real time, and he was the one who had unleashed it. The thought pressed against his chest like a crushing weight. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words broke apart in his throat. The girl who had warned him before now moved cautiously down the aisle. Her body trembled, her lips quivered, but her eyes were fixed on the cow-headed figure. She spoke slowly, not to the teacher, not to the other children, but directly to the creature itself. "You are not the story," she said, her voice cracking but firm. "The story is only the door," and he opened it. The teacher looked up at her in horror, realizing the meaning in her words. The tale of Goou was never meant to be an ordinary legend, never a piece of folklore to be repeated for fun. It was a vessel, a channel, a binding ritual disguised as narrative. The act of telling it aloud was an invocation, a summoning that invited the thing behind the words to cross over. Suddenly, the fragmented warnings he had read in dusty journals took on new meaning. The monks who whispered it in secrecy, the generations who refused to write it down, they were not protecting the story from being lost. They were protecting the world from hearing it. Everything that had happened on the bus now made sense in a dreadful way. The boy who fainted in the second row had been the first sign of the door opening, his body collapsing under the strain of being too close to it. The forest outside had stilled because the world around them had begun to bend inward, isolating them from reality. The broken light, the scraping hooves, the stench of decay, all warnings that the story was no longer confined to the page. The girl continued speaking, her words strangely steady for someone her age. "It feeds on fear," she whispered. "The more we listen, the stronger it becomes. The more we believe, the closer it comes. That's why they told us never to hear it. That's why no one remembers after they survive. It steals the memory to keep itself hidden." Her explanation reframed even the modern retellings. The teacher recalled the rumor of the school bus full of unconscious children, none able to recall the story afterward. They had not forgotten because of shock. They had forgotten because the creature demanded it, erasing their minds to prevent them from passing the full tale on. Each time the story spread, it reached further, pulling more people into its shadow. And he had just become the newest link in that chain. The teacher slumped against his seat, his voice breaking as he finally admitted the truth aloud. "I thought it was harmless, just words. I didn't believe it could be real." His confession did nothing to change what had already been set in motion. The cow-headed figure tilted its skull toward him, its broken jaw hanging loose. And for an instant he felt as though every thought in his mind was being pulled forward, sucked into that hollow gaze. His childhood memories, his reasons for becoming a teacher, his sense of self, all of it flickered in front of him, like pages being ripped from a book. He clawed at his temples, screaming, as though trying to hold on to what was his. The girl raised her voice sharply, snapping the others from their terror. "Cover your ears!" she cried. "Don't let it take you in." Some obeyed, pressing their palms against their heads, squeezing their eyes shut. The groaning sound of the creature faltered, just slightly, as though weakened by the act of resistance. The teacher, too shaken to move, only stared as the girl's command seemed to repel the thing for a heartbeat. In that moment of fragile clarity, a horrifying truth crystallized. The curse was not undefeatable. It thrived only where it was welcomed. Hearing the story, believing it, fearing it, these were the open doors. And the only defense was to deny it, to shut the mind and ears against its words. This was why the monks had warned listeners to cover their ears, why entire generations refused to repeat the tale. Not out of superstition, but survival. The bus shook again, the creature's massive frame swaying forward, its glowing sockets sweeping the rows like searchlights. Wherever its gaze lingered, another child collapsed. Yet those with hands pressed tightly over their ears managed to resist, though their bodies trembled violently with the effort. The girl's voice carried over the chaos, loud and clear. "It cannot stay where it is not invited. Do not listen. Do not let it in." Her words reframed everything. The cursed story was not a story at all. It was a ritual, and the teacher had been its unknowing priest. The children were not just his audience, they were its sacrifice. The realization hit the teacher harder than anything else. His need to entertain, his curiosity, his arrogance had all conspired to bring them here. He had not only endangered himself, but every soul on that bus. And now, as the grotesque head of Goou loomed closer, he finally understood that there would be no full resolution, no neat ending, only the faint hope that some of them might resist long enough to escape its grip. But whether that hope was real, or merely another illusion of the story, none of them could yet know. The bus shook violently one last time, as if the weight of the creature was too much for it to bear. Several students screamed, clutching their ears, while others had already slumped unconscious in their seats. The air was thick with the stench of rot, so heavy it seemed impossible to breathe. The teacher, broken by guilt and terror, reached for the scattered pages on the floor, as if somehow destroying them could undo what had been unleashed. But before his fingers touched the paper, the bus was swallowed in silence. The groaning sound stopped. The scraping hooves stopped. Even the engine had gone still. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy, suffocating quiet. Slowly, the teacher looked up, and the aisle was empty. The grotesque cow's head, the hulking figure, the glowing sockets, all of it had vanished, leaving only the shattered light above and the terrified faces of the few students still conscious. He staggered to his feet, heart pounding, trying to process what had happened. The girl who had warned them stood trembling but upright, her palms still pressed firmly over her ears. She opened her eyes and met his, her expression grim. "It isn't gone," she whispered. It never leaves. It only waits. Before he could ask what she meant, the driver slammed his foot on the pedal, forcing the bus back into motion. None of them spoke during the remainder of the journey. Hours passed in silence, the countryside rolling by as though nothing had happened. When they finally reached their destination, most of the children stirred awake with blank expressions. They blinked in confusion, asking, why everyone looked so pale, why the teacher's hands shook so violently. They could not remember the story, nor the creature, nor the terror that had nearly consumed them. Their memories had been wiped clean, leaving only emptiness where the nightmare had been. Only 2 people remembered the teacher who had read the words, and the girl who had tried to stop him. Both carried the weight of that night, knowing the truth none of the others could recall, and yet, somewhere deep inside, the teacher felt the words still alive in him, waiting. Because once Goou's story is heard, it never truly disappears. The only question is, when will it be told again? The tale of Goou shows how a story itself can become a doorway, pulling the listener into something that was never meant to be heard. But not all curses arrive through words alone. In Japan, there are rituals and games that tempt people into inviting spirits directly into their lives. Some are played out of boredom, others for thrills, yet each carries the same warning. Once you begin, it may be impossible to walk away. And among these dangerous pastimes, one stands out as deceptively simple, a childhood game whispered about in classrooms, feared by teachers, and banned in schools across the country. It is known as Kokurisan, the cursed game of divination, and those who play it rarely walk away unchanged. Kokurisan was never meant to feel dangerous at first glance. To many children in Japan, it was just a game, a curious way to pass the time between classes or to frighten each other during after-school hangouts. The main character in this story was no different. A high school student who had always laughed off ghost tales, rolling his eyes at warnings about spirits and curses. To him, fear was entertainment, something to stir up among friends and then dismiss with a laugh. But curiosity, as it so often does, had its way of finding cracks in disbelief. It began inside a quiet classroom on a rainy afternoon. The storm outside had canceled sports practice, trapping the students indoors with nothing but their own restlessness. Raindrops streaked down the windows, tapping with a steady rhythm that made the silence between them feel heavier. The teacher had stepped out, and with no one watching, a small group gathered at the back of the room. Among them was the student, drawn not by belief but by boredom. He wanted to see for himself whether the game that had been banned by teachers and whispered about in hallways was really as frightening as everyone claimed. The setup of Kokurisan was deceptively simple. On the chalkboard at the front of the class, they wrote out hiragana characters neatly onto a large sheet of paper. At the top were the words yes and no, and at the bottom the symbol of a torii gate, the sacred marker of the spirit's arrival and departure. A single 10-yen coin was placed at the center of the paper, its dull metal catching the flicker of fluorescent light above. They laughed nervously as they placed their fingers lightly on the coin, each one pretending not to care but unable to hide the tremor of anticipation. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound pressing against the glass until it drowned out everything else. The air in the room cooled, though no windows were open. One of the girls whispered the opening words of the ritual, calling the spirit of Kokurisan to come forth and answer their questions. At first, nothing happened. The coin sat still, unmovable beneath their fingers. Someone snickered, breaking the tension, and a few began to tease the girl leading the chant. But then the coin shifted just a slight tremble, so faint they could have dismissed it as imagination. Only, none of them pulled away. Their eyes widened, their bodies leaning closer, and again the coin scraped across the paper, slowly sliding toward the top. The movement was steady, deliberate, and far too strong to be explained away as a simple twitch of their hands. The student felt his pulse quicken, though he forced a grin. This was what he had come for, to prove the game was nothing but nerves and suggestion. But, in the back of his mind, a seed of doubt began to grow. If none of them were pushing, then what was moving the coin? The first question came almost as a joke. One of the boys asked if Kokurisan was really there. The coin slid upward, stopping firmly on yes. Laughter followed, nervous and strained, but no one removed their hand. Something about the moment made them feel bound to the game, as if pulling away would break a rule they did not yet understand. The rain hammered harder against the windows. The classroom, once familiar, seemed foreign in the dim light, its corners stretched with shadows that refused to sit still. The student glanced at the blackboard and thought he saw the reflection of the coin move a fraction of a second before it actually did. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. And then came the real purpose, the question whispered by one of the girls, her voice trembling. She asked who among them would die first. The group gasped. A few tried to laugh it off, but none removed their fingers. The coin trembled, then began to move, scraping slowly across the paper toward the letters that would form a name. The student watched in horror as it spelled out the name of one of his classmates, sitting only a few seats away. In that moment, the laughter stopped entirely. The game was no longer entertainment. It had become something darker, something that felt alive inside the room, and none of them dared to lift their hands. The coin stopped moving, its dull metal glinting faintly under the flickering classroom lights. Every breath in the room seemed to freeze. The paper now displayed the name of one of their classmates, a boy sitting only a few desks away, staring wide-eyed at the characters as though they had been carved into his skin. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the rain against the windows grew louder, heavier, until it felt as though the storm itself was pressing against the walls. Finally, someone broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "It's just a joke," one of the boys said, trying to brush it off. "Someone's pushing it." He accused another, but the denial came immediately, sharp and defensive. One by one, every player swore they hadn't moved the coin. Their voices cracked, their hands trembled, and yet none of them dared to pull away. It was as if their fingers had fused to the metal, as if to leave now would break some unseen rule. The boy whose name had been spelled shifted uneasily in his seat. "Stop messing around," he muttered, though his voice was thin and unsteady. His eyes darted to the coin, then to the others, searching for some rational explanation. But the more he tried to dismiss it, the more the air in the room seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward. The first strange event came quickly. The fluorescent light above them buzzed, flickered once, and then went out completely, leaving the classroom bathed in a dim gray glow from the storm outside. Several students screamed, jerking back in fright, but their hands stayed pressed to the coin as if held there by force. The girl leading the game whispered frantically that they couldn't stop now, not until they asked the spirit to leave. Her words were almost lost in the patter of rain, but her urgency was unmistakable. The student at the center of our story felt his pulse hammer in his ears. He had started this game out of boredom, out of disbelief, but now a heaviness sat in his chest. He looked at the paper and swore the inked characters seemed darker than before, as though the paper itself had aged in the span of minutes. The Torii symbol at the bottom seemed to stretch, its lines bending like warped wood. He blinked hard, telling himself it was a trick of the dim light, but the unease only deepened. The girl whispered another question. "Kokurisan, is the one whose name you spelled truly going to die?" The coin jerked, harder than before, sliding across the paper with a metallic scrape that set their teeth on edge. It landed firmly on yes. The boy whose name had been spelled stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "This is stupid." He tried to storm out of the circle, but as he turned, the door to the classroom rattled violently, the knob twisting on its own. Every head snapped toward it, their blood running cold. No footsteps approached. No voices came from the hall. The door simply rattled as though something unseen clawed at it from the other side. The students screamed, some covering their mouths, others clutching at one another. The boy stopped in his tracks, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the door. "Who's there?" he called, but the only response was silence. Slowly, the rattling stopped. The room fell still again, but the dread it left behind was suffocating. They turned back to the paper, and the coin was already moving. None of them had pushed it, yet it scraped steadily toward another character, then another, spelling out words they didn't want to read. This time, the letters formed a date 3 days from now. The boy's legs buckled, and he sank back into his chair, muttering frantically under his breath. "It's not real. It's not real." But no one dared correct him. The weight of the game pressed on them all, and even those who wanted to dismiss it could feel something unnatural in the room. The storm outside seemed to have grown darker, the rain louder, as though the world beyond had vanished, and only the classroom remained. The student at the center of our story glanced at the blackboard again. For the briefest second, he thought he saw something in the reflection of the window, the faint outline of a figure standing behind them, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching. He blinked, and it was gone, but the chill that ran down his spine told him it hadn't been imagination. The girl leading the ritual looked around desperately. "We have to end it properly," she said. "We have to say goodbye. If we don't, it won't leave." Her voice was shrill, panicked, but the others only stared at her in fear, unable to decide whether to listen. Ending it meant admitting they believed. And yet, the longer they hesitated, the heavier the air became. The darker the room seemed, the more certain they all were that something had answered their call. The first complication was clear now. This wasn't just a game to pass the time. The coin, the paper, the storm, the strange rattling door, all of it pointed to something waiting just beyond the veil. And the longer they played, the closer it seemed to come. The classroom felt smaller by the minute, as if the storm outside was pressing against the windows and squeezing the walls inward. The coin still sat in the middle of the paper, surrounded by trembling fingers that no one dared lift away. The boy, whose name had been spelled, sat frozen in his chair, his face ghostly pale, eyes darting between the others as though waiting for someone to laugh and admit it was all a prank. But no one laughed. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy over them all. Then came the second strange event. Without warning, every clock in the room stopped. The faint tick-tick that had been background noise throughout the afternoon fell silent. One of the girls noticed first, pointing with a shaking finger to the large wall clock above the chalkboard. Its hands were stuck exactly at the moment the coin spelled out the date of the boy's death. At the same time, several students checked their watches or phones, and each one displayed the same frozen minute, unchanging. A suffocating stillness spread through the room, as if time itself had paused in recognition of what the game had revealed. The silence broke when one of the boys, louder, braver, or perhaps more foolish than the rest, snatched his hands off the coin and stood up. "This is all fake," he said, his voice harsh, shaking with more fear than he wanted to admit. "You're all letting your imaginations run wild. Someone's pushing it, and you're too scared to admit it." The others gasped, their eyes darting from him to the paper. The girl leading the ritual nearly screamed. "Don't let go! You can't break the circle until we say goodbye." Her words rang with panic, but the boy only scoffed and kicked his chair back, trying to appear defiant. "Goodbye to what? It's just a piece of paper." As if in response to his defiance, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Their breath fogged in the air, though the windows remained sealed tight. The coin twitched violently, scraping beneath the remaining fingers of the circle, though none of them moved it. It dragged itself across the paper, faster now, spelling out letters with furious precision. The message was short, but its meaning was enough to send shivers down every spine. "Don't leave." The boy froze, his bravado cracking instantly. He stumbled backward, his heel catching the leg of his chair, nearly sending him sprawling. The others sat in horrified silence, staring at the letters. It wasn't a game anymore. Something was aware of them, something that demanded their attention. The girl whispered frantically, almost chanting, "We have to close it before it's too late." Her voice shook, but she tried to steady herself, to remember the steps she had read about in whispered warnings online. The ritual had rules, and if those rules weren't followed, the spirit lingered. That was the danger, the reason so many teachers banned the game outright. But a new layer of tension emerged. The boy who had broken the circle refused to sit back down. "I'm not touching that again," he said, his face pale, but his jaw set. "I'm done." His refusal left the group divided, half terrified of continuing without him, half terrified of what might happen if they stopped. Meanwhile, the student at the center of our story couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The reflection in the window caught his eye again, and this time he was certain he saw a movement, a flicker of a shadow not their own. Something with long, thin fingers brushing across the glass, disappearing the moment he blinked. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling against the coin, but he said nothing. Speaking it aloud would make it real. The girl leading the ritual tried again. "Kokurisan, please return through the torii. Please leave us now." But the coin didn't move. It stayed still beneath their hands, heavy as stone. For the first time, she looked truly afraid, not just of the spirit, but of the possibility that it would refuse to go. Then came the clue, subtle but terrifying. The words on the paper hiragana, yes, no, tori, seemed to shift in the dim light, their edges curling, as if they were no longer ink but carved grooves. The tori symbol at the bottom, once a simple drawing, now seemed deeper, darker, almost like a hole. The student swore it pulsed faintly, as though something waited just beyond, watching, deciding whether to step through. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the windows, thunder booming so close the glass shivered. The girl repeated her plea, her voice cracking with desperation, but the coin stayed still. The conflicting voices inside the room, one demanding they stop, another urging them to continue the ritual, and the silence of the boy, marked for death, clashed together, building into a crescendo of dread. None of them knew the answer. None of them knew the rules well enough to be certain. And so, the game continued, dragging them deeper into a web where every move, every word, and every breath might be the one that allowed Kokurisan to step fully through. The classroom had become a trap, the paper with its hiragana, the coin that no one dared release, the shadows stretching longer with every flicker of lightning outside, all of it felt alive, pulsing with the weight of something unseen. The boy who had broken the circle stood frozen by the door, his earlier defiance drained away. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he wanted to apologize, but no words would come. The girl leading the ritual leaned forward, whispering again, "Kokuri-san, please return through the torii." Her voice trembled, the plea sounding more desperate with each repetition. Still, the coin would not budge. It sat heavy under their fingers, as if welded to the paper. The storm outside intensified, the rain hammering against the windows so violently that the glass bowed inward. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, then died altogether, plunging the room into darkness, except for the flashes of lightning that illuminated their terrified faces in sharp, stuttering glimpses. Then came the sound that none of them would ever forget. A scratching, faint at first, like nails dragged across the underside of the desks. It circled the room slowly, scraping along the metal legs, moving from one corner to the next. The students whimpered, their bodies trembling. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loudly. The scratching grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to come from directly beneath their own feet. The student at the center of our story felt it strongest. A vibration through the floorboards, a faint rumble beneath his shoes, as though something was crawling just below them, waiting for its chance to emerge. He pressed harder against the coin, trying to convince himself it was still only a game. But then he saw it. The Torii symbol at the bottom of the paper, the one they had drawn so carelessly with chalk earlier, was no longer flat. It bulged outward slightly, like a doorway swelling from within, straining against the page. The girl gasped, her eyes locked on the same spot. "It's trying to come through," she whispered. The boy marked for death finally broke his silence. His voice was hoarse, strangled with fear. "Ask it if it's me, if it's here for me." The girl shook her head violently. "No, don't give it more. Don't feed it." But the others, drawn by morbid curiosity, whispered the question aloud anyway, their voices blending into a trembling chorus. "Kokurisan, are you here for him?" The coin moved instantly. No hesitation, no pause. It scraped upward to yes. The boy stumbled back in his chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. His chest heaved as if he couldn't breathe. He begged them to stop, begged them to end it, but the coin was already sliding again. This time, it spelled out another word, each letter appearing with dreadful slowness. Now. The storm exploded outside with a crack of thunder so loud it rattled the desks. At that exact moment, the classroom door slammed shut on its own, trapping them all inside. The boy at the door screamed, pounding his fists against it, but it would not open. His cries mingled with the sobs of his classmates, the sound twisting into a chorus of terror that seemed to fuel the presence in the room. The scratching beneath the desks stopped suddenly. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the black glass of the windows, eyes appeared, dozens of them, glowing faintly, reflecting the lightning. They blinked in unison, unblinking yet alive, staring into the room with a hunger that made the students recoil. Some buried their faces against their arms. Others squeezed their eyes shut, but the weight of those eyes could be felt pressing on their skin, their thoughts, their very breath. The Torii on the paper pulsed once, twice, and then split open down the middle like a crack in stone. The student could barely comprehend what he was seeing, a hole forming in the page itself, impossibly deep, as if it led somewhere far beyond the classroom. From that darkness, a hand emerged thin, with long claws, its skin gray and mottled like old paper. It reached outward, dragging its nails across the coin, making it screech against the board. The girl leading the ritual screamed, yanking her hands back, but the coin moved anyway, scraping violently as though pushed by an unseen force. "Stay." The letters spelled themselves out, each stroke of the coin punctuated by another crack of thunder. The students cried out, voices breaking, some trying to flee, others too terrified to move. The boy marked for death pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide, his breaths short and ragged. The clawed hand inched closer to the edge of the paper, curling as though preparing to pull itself fully through. "What is going on?" The student thought desperately, his mind spinning. Was it real? Was it a collective hallucination? Or had they truly opened a door that should never have been touched? The girl shouted again, her voice cutting through the panic. "Cover your ears. Don't listen. Don't look at it." Her desperate command echoed the same warning given in hushed stories about Kokurisan, that once the spirit fixed its gaze on you, the only way to survive was to deny it, to starve it of your attention. But the question lingered, heavy and unanswered. Had they already given too much? The paper trembled, the tori split wider, and the claw pushed further through. The rules of the game were unraveling before their eyes, and they had no idea how far it would go, or whether any of them would leave the classroom alive. The classroom had descended into chaos, shrieks, pounding fists against the locked door, the scrape of chairs pushed back in panic. Yet amid the terror, the girl who had led the ritual stood frozen, her eyes locked on the paper. She had played Kokurisan before, years ago, in a different school. Back then, nothing serious had happened. Just a coin that twitched vague answers to silly questions. But she remembered something. Something whispered by an older cousin who had warned her never to try it. The words came back now with bone-deep clarity. "If you don't close the gate, it won't leave. It will follow you." Her cousin's warning reframed everything. The rattling door, the stopped clocks, the glowing eyes in the window. They weren't random hauntings. They were signs of the spirit's refusal to return. The group hadn't ended the ritual. They had asked questions, taken answers, but no one had guided Kokuri-san back through the tori. They had left the door wide open, and now something was slipping through. The girl dropped to her knees beside the paper. Her voice trembled, but grew louder with each word. "Kokuri-san, thank you for coming. Please return now." Through the tori. It was the formal closing line, the one buried in scattered warnings online and whispered among children who played the game in secret. But the coin didn't move. It sat motionless under the trembling fingers still clinging to it. The classroom buzzed with fear as the clawed hand on the page flexed and scraped, pulling harder against the edges of the paper as though resisting her command. The student at the center of our story stared in disbelief. Until now, he had convinced himself it was just fear, just suggestion, just a storm amplifying nerves. But this was no illusion. The paper pulsed like flesh. The claw left scratches in the wood of the desk itself. The game was no longer confined to imagination, it had crossed into reality. The boy, marked for death, whimpered in the corner, his head buried in his arms. "It's me," he sobbed. "It already chose me." His words cut through the group, feeding the dread that maybe there was no way to undo what had been set in motion. But the girl snapped at him, her voice sharper than before. "That's what it wants. Fear gives it strength. If you believe it's already won, then it has." Her outburst reframed the earlier events, the boy fainting, the rattling door, the frozen clocks. The spirit hadn't simply been answering questions. It had been feeding on their fear, their belief, their willingness to see every coincidence as proof. The more they gave it, the stronger it became. The only way to weaken it was to deny it, to strip it of the attention it demanded. She looked around at the others, tears streaming down her face. "Don't look at the paper. Don't listen to it. Don't believe the words." But it was easier said than done. The coin twitched violently again, dragging itself across the paper. The letters it spelled were not random, not vague. This time it wrote, "Already here." The words sent a shiver through the group. Several students screamed, others covered their ears, but most couldn't stop staring. The paper seemed to vibrate under the weight of those words, as if every syllable was an anchor pulling the spirit deeper into their world. The main student squeezed his eyes shut, clenching his teeth. He realized with dawning horror that they had all fallen into the same trap. The spirit wasn't just answering their questions. It was shaping their thoughts, leading them step by step into giving it exactly what it needed: acknowledgement. Every time they reacted, every time they asked, they gave it power. The girl pressed her palms to the desk, shouting now over the thunder. "You are not welcome. We close this gate." She forced the coin back toward the torii, dragging it under her own strength. The metal screeched across the paper, but for a moment it worked. The claw froze, fingers curling back as if resisting a pull. The lights above flickered, buzzing faintly. The storm outside seemed to pause, the thunder delaying, the rain softening. It was as though the classroom itself was holding its breath. The girl shoved harder, her voice breaking. "Go back!" Return through the torii, and then, with one last scrape, the coin slid fully onto the symbol. The paper convulsed like a living thing, the torii cracking down the middle before snapping shut. The claw withdrew violently, vanishing into the page as though sucked away. The coin spun in place once, twice, then clattered flat against the desk. The room fell silent. The children collapsed into their seats, gasping, sobbing, clutching one another in disbelief. The air felt lighter, the stench of rot lifting, the pressure in their chests easing. For the first time in what felt like hours, the storm outside sounded like just a storm again, but the relief was thin, fragile, and incomplete. The boy marked for death lifted his head slowly, his face streaked with tears. "It's gone?" he asked, his voice small and trembling. The girl didn't answer. Her hands still hovered over the paper, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the coin, because even though the torii had closed, the writing on the page remained. Faint but visible, etched into the fibers of the paper as if burned there permanently, were the words it had spelled before. Now. Don't leave. And worst of all, already here. The spirit had returned. That much was clear. But the message left behind suggested something else entirely. It had not been fully banished. It had marked them. It had chosen one. And whether the game had truly ended, or whether it had only just begun, none of them could say. The classroom was silent, except for the ragged sound of breathing. Chairs lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor, the chalkboard streaked with faint cracks from where the storm had rattled the building. The coin sat perfectly still in the center of the paper, harmless now, as though nothing had ever happened, but no one dared touch it. The girl finally pulled her hands back, her knuckles white, her body shaking with exhaustion. "It's done," she whispered, though her eyes betrayed doubt. The others clung to her. Words, desperately, nodding, convincing themselves it had worked. The storm outside eased, the rain softening into a steady drizzle. Slowly, the fluorescent lights flickered back to life, humming with their usual comforting drone. The world seemed to be returning to normal. One by one, the students gathered their things, too shaken to speak. Some refused to look at the paper at all, while others glanced nervously over their shoulders, as if expecting the claw to emerge again. The boy, whose name had been spelled out earlier, moved last. His face was pale, his expression hollow, but he forced himself to his feet and muttered, "See? We're fine. Just a stupid game." Yet his voice was unconvincing, even to himself. As they filed out of the classroom, no one turned back to clean up the ritual. The paper remained on the desk, the coin resting on the torii, the faint, etched words still visible. Now, don't leave. Already here. The lights above flickered once more as the door clicked shut behind them. 3 days later, the school was quiet again, students whispering about the accident. A car crash, sudden and brutal. The name of the boy spelled out on the paper was written across the headlines. None of his classmates spoke of Kokurisan. None admitted what they had seen. But sometimes, late at night, those who had played the game swore they heard it again. The faint scrape of a coin across paper. The whisper of claws against wood. A reminder that even if the torii had closed, the spirit had never really left. It was still waiting, and it had already chosen. The story of Kokurisan shows how a simple game can open doors that should never be touched, inviting something unseen to step into our world. But not every spirit needs a ritual to find you. Some wait in silence, hidden in plain sight, taking the most familiar faces and twisting them into something unbearable. In Japan, countless travelers have told of walking home late at night, only to realize the person beside them is not who they thought. A smile turns to smooth skin, a loved one becomes unrecognizable, and the mind unravels under the weight of what it sees. This is the terror of the Noperabo, the faceless ghost, a spirit that doesn't need to harm your body because once you've seen it, your sanity is already slipping away. Oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know that tomorrow I'll be uploading a story about an Asian ghost that, according to the older native inhabitants, is still alive, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. The tale of the Noperabo begins with a man whose life was as ordinary as the streets he walked every evening. A samurai, neither of great fame nor great disgrace, he lived a disciplined routine in Edo, the city that would one day become Tokyo. His days were spent in the service of his lord, his nights in the comfort of his wife's company. But discipline breeds habit, and habit breeds repetition, and it was within this repetition that the extraordinary would take hold. On the evening of this story, the samurai was returning home later than usual. The city had long since quieted, its lantern-lit streets nearly empty, save for the distant echo of sandals slapping against wet stone. The moon hung low, its pale light bleeding across the rooftops, while the wind carried the faint scent of river water. The air was heavy, charged with that peculiar silence that seems to cling before a storm, though the sky was clear. His path took him toward the riverbank, a place he normally avoided at night. Stories among the townspeople spoke of strange encounters, their lone figures seen in the fog, familiar voices that led travelers astray, faces glimpsed and then forgotten. Yet the samurai, ever rational, dismissed such tales as the mutterings of farmers and drunkards. Tonight, however, he felt the weight of them more keenly, as if the very shadows pressed closer the further he walked. It was there, by the edge of the water, that he saw her, his wife. She stood with her back turned, the hem of her kimono brushing against the reeds, her dark hair glistening faintly in the moonlight. Relief surged through him, banishing the unease that had crept into his thoughts. He smiled despite himself, calling out her name, though confusion prickled at the back of his mind. Why would she be here, at this hour, waiting by the river? She turned slowly, her head tilting just enough to catch the pale glow of the moon. Her lips curled into a smile, familiar and warm, a comfort after the long day's journey. Yet something about the moment was off. The river's surface rippled without wind. The cicadas had gone silent. The world seemed to hold its breath as he stepped closer. His purpose was simple. He wanted only to walk her home, to leave behind the desolate riverside and return to the warmth of their house. But with each step he took, unease returned, heavier than before. The smile on her face seemed too wide, too still. The shadows clinging to her form seemed too deep, and though her eyes were fixed on him, he felt as though they weren't looking at him at all. The samurai's life had been built upon certainty, the certainty of duty, of honor, of the routines that kept his world predictable. But on that riverbank, with the strange stillness of the night pressing in and his wife standing silently before him, that certainty began to unravel. Something waited just beyond the surface of this encounter, something he could not yet name. And as he reached out to her, the story of the Noperabo, the faceless ghost, was about to reveal itself. The samurai slowed his steps as he drew closer to the riverbank, his sandals pressing softly into the damp earth. His wife still stood there, perfectly still, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the moon. From a distance, everything about her seemed normal. The curve of her shoulders, the way her kimono wrapped around her form, the familiar drape of her hair. Yet the longer he looked, the more something unspoken gnawed at him. She hadn't moved since he first saw her, not even a shift of weight, not the subtle rise and fall of breath. Only her smile remained fixed, calm, and unchanging. It should have reassured him, yet instead it unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. A question formed quietly in his mind. Why had she come here, alone, at this hour? When he finally reached her, he spoke softly, almost hesitant. "Why are you here? Did you come to meet me?" His voice, usually firm, sounded uncertain in the heavy silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the same smile plastered on her lips. The expression seemed warmer at first, but after a moment it became eerie, frozen, like a mask that refused to move. The samurai's unease deepened. He searched for the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the small gestures of affection he knew so well. But there was nothing. Her gaze passed through him, as though he were a stranger, and for a moment he wondered if she had heard him at all. Then came the first strange event. She lifted her hand slowly, gracefully, and gestured for him to step closer. Her movement was fluid, but wrong somehow deliberate, yet too measured, as if mimicking something human rather than being human. The samurai obeyed, stepping toward her, though every part of him screamed to hesitate. The closer he came, the more he noticed the details that didn't belong. Her skin was unusually pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, and there was no glimmer of moisture in her eyes. They looked painted, unreal, like the empty gaze of a doll. He stopped only a pace away, his heart pounding. "Say something," he whispered, almost pleading now. "You're frightening me." And then she laughed. It was not a loud laugh, nor a cruel one. It was soft, gentle, the kind of laugh she would give him on quiet evenings at home. Yet it carried a hollow tone, echoing slightly, as though the sound came from somewhere else entirely. His stomach turned cold. This was his wife's laugh, yet it didn't belong to her. The samurai stepped back instinctively, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword. He didn't draw it. How could he, against his wife? But his body braced for something unseen. The river rippled faintly, though no breeze stirred the reeds. The night air thickened, pressing on his lungs, each breath harder than the last. Finally, she moved again. Her head tilted further to one side, the smile fading. Slowly, unbearably slowly, her features began to shift. Her eyes seemed to blur at the edges, melting into the smoothness of her skin. Her nose flattened, vanishing as though it had never been there. Her lips quivered once, then dissolved, leaving behind nothing but blank, pale flesh where her face should have been. The samurai staggered backward, his breath caught in his throat. His mind fought to comprehend what his eyes saw, but there was no explanation, no frame of reference. The face he had loved, the face he had trusted, was gone, wiped clean like ink washed from paper. And yet, though she had no eyes, no mouth, no nose, the faceless figure still turned her blank gaze toward him. He could feel it, heavy and oppressive, as if her eyeless stare pierced directly into his soul. Panic surged in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his duty and disbelief anchored him in place. This was his wife, or something wearing her form. If he fled, what would become of her? If he stayed, what would become of him? The figure took a step forward, one simple step, silent against the wet earth, and the samurai's knees nearly buckled. His mind swirled with questions he could not voice. Was this truly his wife, transformed into something monstrous? Or was this something else entirely, a spirit wearing her image like a disguise? The air around him grew colder, the river's surface eerily still. The cicadas, that had once filled the night with sound, remained silent, as though even nature had fled from this moment. The samurai's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, though he still could not bring himself to draw it. And then, as quickly as it had shifted, the figure turned away, stepping calmly along the riverbank as though nothing had happened. For a fleeting moment, her face seemed to shimmer back into place, the eyes, the smile, the familiar features. It was almost enough to convince him he had imagined it. But deep down, he knew better. The first complication was set. Something was deeply wrong with his wife, with the river, with the night itself, and though she had walked away, the image of her blank face clung to his mind, burning itself into him like a curse. He could not run. He had to follow. And with every step he took after her, the sense of dread grew heavier, as if he were walking not toward his home, but toward the unraveling of everything he thought was real. The samurai's footsteps echoed against the riverbank as he stumbled after the figure that wore his wife's form. His heart hammered in his chest, but his thoughts spun even faster, torn between disbelief and terror. She had no face. He had seen it with his own eyes. Yet only moments later her features had flickered back into place, as if nothing had happened. The contradiction gnawed at him. Was he losing his mind? Or had he truly stepped into the realm of the supernatural? The figure walked ahead calmly, her gait too steady for someone caught wandering the riverside at night. The moonlight clung unnaturally to her, outlining her silhouette with a pale glow that made her seem less solid, more like a reflection than a body of flesh and bone. She didn't speak, didn't turn back to him, didn't acknowledge his desperate whispers calling her name. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint lapping of water against the stones. Then came the second strange event. The samurai blinked, and suddenly she was gone. One moment her figure glided ahead. The next, the riverbank was empty, the reeds swaying gently in the night wind. He froze, scanning the shadows, his breath caught in his throat. Panic surged as he spun toward the path home, and there she was, standing directly in his way. Her face looked normal again, perfectly familiar. The same soft eyes, the same lips, the same woman he had left at home earlier that day. She smiled faintly, lifting her hand as though to brush his cheek. For a moment, relief nearly broke through his fear, but then her features rippled again. The smile slipped, the eyes blurred, the mouth flattened. Within seconds her face was once again a blank canvas of smooth skin, featureless and horrifying. The samurai stumbled backward, almost falling into the reeds. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his chest, strangled by disbelief. How could the woman he loved be reduced to this? Before he could gather his senses, a voice spoke from behind him. "Don't look too long!" He whirled, hand flying to his sword. An old fisherman stood a few paces away, leaning heavily on his pole. His face was lined with years, his eyes glimmering with something more than age. "If you stare at it," the old man continued, It takes more than your sight. It takes your spirit. The samurai's knuckles whitened on his hilt. What is it? He demanded. The fisherman's gaze shifted past him, toward the faceless figure now standing utterly still. Noperabo, he whispered. The word barely carried over the rustle of reeds. They wear the faces of those we love, until we trust them enough to look closely. Then they take it away. Once you see it, you can never unsee. And many who do don't last long afterward. The samurai's breath came in shallow gasps. The warning chilled him more than the apparition itself. If the old man spoke true, the faceless ghost was not just an illusion, it was a curse. His vision of his wife, stripped bare, was not a trick of the night, but the beginning of something far worse. The conflicting voices pulled at him. His duty, his heart, demanded he run to his wife and protect her, to demand answers, to fight, if necessary. But the fisherman's quiet words carried the weight of survival. "Turn back," the man urged. "If you follow, it will follow you home, and then it will not be only your wife's face you lose." But the samurai couldn't turn back. The thought of leaving the figure, whether ghost or wife alone on the riverbank, was unbearable. What if it truly was her? What if she needed him? The fisherman sighed, lowering his eyes. "You samurai are all the same. Pride makes you blind. But remember this, the faceless ones never come alone." The clue sank in like a stone in his stomach. Never alone. If this was a Noperabo, then there would be more waiting, perhaps even at his home. His mind flickered with memory the way his wife had kissed him goodbye that morning, her smile warm, her eyes filled with quiet devotion. What if the woman before him was only a mask, and the real wife was already gone? A rustle came from the reeds. Another figure stepped into the moonlight. A villager, perhaps, or another traveler. The samurai's breath caught as he recognized the man, an old acquaintance from his days of service. Relief surged for a heartbeat, but then the man turned toward him, and his features melted away into smooth, empty flesh. Two faceless ghosts now stood before him, and somewhere behind them, hidden in the shadows, he felt more watching. The fisherman backed away slowly, muttering a prayer under his breath. "You still have time to leave," he warned, "but not much." The samurai's choice was narrowing, the tension twisting around him. The faceless ghosts weren't attacking, not yet. They were waiting, silent, patient, waiting for him to stare too long, to falter, to break. And as the samurai stood caught between his sword, his fear, and his desperate need to know the truth about his wife, he realized something that chilled him more than the blank faces themselves. The ghosts had not appeared to stop him. They had appeared to lead him. Where they were leading him, and what waited at the end of that path, he did not yet know. The riverbank had become a stage, and the samurai stood trapped at its center. The reeds swayed as though stirred by breath, though the night was windless. Before him loomed two faceless figures, their skin pale and smooth, their heads tilting ever so slightly as if studying him without eyes. Behind them, in the shadows, he sensed others waiting, invisible but palpable, like unseen spectators holding their silence. His hand clung to the hilt of his sword, though the weight of it brought no comfort. What blade could cut through something that had no face, no flesh, no clear form? His training told him to strike, to defend his honor and his life. His instincts told him that drawing steel against these things would only hasten whatever fate they carried with them. The fisherman had retreated into the darkness, his warning still echoing. They never come alone. The samurai's chest tightened as the words replayed in his mind. If two had revealed themselves already, how many more lingered unseen? The faceless figure that wore his wife's form stepped forward. Its movements were smooth, deliberate. every motion human yet unnervingly exact, as though it had studied people for centuries and perfected the art of mimicry. Her kimono rustled softly, her posture dignified, exactly as he remembered. For one unbearable instant, he longed to believe it truly was her. But the blank skin where her face should have been erased, that hope. Still, the apparition raised a hand, palm outward, a gesture of familiarity. She had done this countless times before in greeting. The samurai's breath faltered. Was it taunting him? Or was this some remnant of his wife bleeding through? The second faceless ghost moved closer as well, its body shifting in the moonlight, morphing subtly until it resembled his old acquaintance more fully. The stance, the shoulders, the way it held itself, except for the missing face. The mimicry was flawless in every detail but one, and that absence was worse than any monstrous mask. Then came the sound soft at first, then rising. A faint rustle, like whispers carried by the reeds. But no lips moved. The faceless had no mouths to speak. The whispers seemed to vibrate from the air itself, curling into his ears without language, without meaning, yet pressing on his thoughts with suffocating weight. His heart pounded harder, his vision blurring at the edges. He staggered back, clutching his temples. "What is happening?" he gasped aloud, but no answer came. The whispers grew louder, layered, overlapping. He thought he heard fragments of voices. He recognized his lord's command, his wife's laughter, the jeers of fellow soldiers, but distorted, hollow, as though stolen and replayed by something that did not understand them. Every sound he had ever trusted twisted against him, pouring into his skull until he thought it might split. And then, in a moment that shattered his sense of reality, he heard his own voice among them. The same cadence, the same tone, repeating words he had spoken earlier that day. "I'll be home before the moon sets." The words he had told his wife before leaving. Now they came back to him from the faceless chorus, drained of warmth, spat back as mockery. The samurai staggered toward the river, desperate to drown out the noise. But there, in the water, his reflection awaited him. His face, at first clear and solid, began to ripple. His eyes dissolved. His mouth melted into smooth flesh. He stumbled back with a strangled cry, clutching at his face as if it too might vanish. His fingers traced the familiar lines of nose and lips, but the reflection showed only emptiness. The faceless ghosts took another synchronized step forward, their smooth faces turned directly toward him. The whispers stopped. Silence fell so abruptly it felt like the air had been stolen from the world. The samurai's breath echoed too loud in his ears. His heart pounded like a drum. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, desperation cracking his voice. The figure that wore his wife's body tilted its head and moved closer still. In one fluid motion, it leaned forward until its featureless face was only inches from his own. He expected coldness, but instead he felt warmth radiating from it, the uncanny warmth of living skin. Then, without eyes, without a mouth, without anything resembling a human face, it breathed. He felt its warm air brushing against his cheek. Impossible, unexplainable, yet undeniable. His body locked, every muscle frozen by terror. The fisherman's warning returned again in his mind. If you stare too long, it takes your spirit. And for the first time, the samurai understood. It wasn't about the faceless taking shape from his wife, or his acquaintance, or anyone else. It was about reflection, recognition. The more he stared, the more he gave. Piece by piece, it would strip his sense of self away until nothing remained but blankness. The realization changed everything. This was no ghost to be fought with steel. This was a mirror turned against him, waiting to erase him as it had erased its own features. And as the whispers began again, low and insidious, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. The Noperabo did not need to kill. It only needed to make him believe that he was already gone. The samurai staggered back from the faceless figure, his chest heaving as though the very air around him had turned poisonous. The warmth of its breath still clung to his cheek, a sickening reminder that what he faced was not a mere apparition, but something tangible, something alive in ways he could not explain. His sword felt useless at his side, heavy with the knowledge that steel could not cut away what he had seen. The whispers returned, curling inside his skull, yet this time they were clearer. Among the echoes of distorted voices, he recognized words, his own words, his wife's, fragments of conversations long past. And it was in that moment he realized the pattern. The Noperabo were not conjuring random sounds. They were feeding back his own memories, stripping them of context, replaying them like hollow performances. A memory came unbidden, the way his wife had smiled at him that very morning, her face gentle, her voice assuring him of her love. He heard it now, twisted, repeated through the whispers that seeped from nowhere. But the voice carried no warmth, no soul. It was only a mask of what had once been true. The revelation struck him like a blade. The faceless ghosts were not merely showing him horror. They were unraveling identity. By stealing the faces of those dearest to him and echoing the words he trusted, they eroded the foundations of who he was. They blurred the line between memory and illusion until he could no longer tell what was real. The fisherman's words earlier now made cruel sense. If you stare too long, it takes your spirit. Spirit was not seized in a single strike. It was drained, slowly, stolen through recognition, through the betrayal of the familiar. The faceless did not kill in violence. They killed in doubt, in despair, in the hollowing of the self until nothing remained but blankness, like their own featureless visages. The samurai's knees buckled, and he sank into the damp earth, clutching at his head. He thought of his wife waiting at home, or was she waiting? Could he trust that the woman he would see upon returning would truly be her, or another mask? The question clawed at his sanity. If a faceless spirit could mimic her so perfectly, how would he ever know the difference again? One of the figures stepped closer, and the world around him seemed to warp. Its smooth face began to ripple again, features emerging slowly, his wife's eyes, his wife's mouth, the curve of her jawline only to fade once more into a blank canvas. It was showing him not just horror, but temptation. A cruel offer to believe, to accept, to surrender to the uncertainty. The fisherman's voice echoed faintly from the shadows, though the man himself was nowhere to be seen. It is not the face they steal. It is your belief in the face. Once that is gone, you are theirs. The words reframed every step of the night. The first meeting by the river, her smile too still. The laughter that echoed without life. The sudden vanishing and reappearing in his path. None of it had been random terror. It had been calculated, designed to chip away at his certainty until he could no longer separate truth from imitation. The samurai forced his trembling body upright. His hand fell from the hilt of his sword. Steel was worthless here. The battle was not of blade against flesh, but of mind against illusion. He closed his eyes tightly, refusing to look at the blankness before him, refusing to acknowledge the whispers replaying his memories. His breathing steadied as he muttered under his breath, as though reciting a mantra. I know who I am. I know Hushi Island. I will not give you more. For a moment, the air lightened. The whispers faltered, their echoes breaking apart like waves crashing on rock. The faceless figures tilted their heads in unison, as though confused by his defiance. The samurai felt strength surge back into his chest, fragile but real. Yet even as he clung to this revelation, dread lingered. He could resist here, now, on this riverbank. But what of tomorrow, when he returned home and saw his wife again? Would he believe it was truly her? Or would every glance, every touch, every word carry the suspicion of the faceless curse? The ghosts seemed to sense his doubt. Slowly, they began to retreat, their smooth forms fading back into the shadows of the reeds. The night grew quieter, the storm clouds parting to reveal a pale sliver of moon. Relief washed over him, but it was hollow, fragile, incomplete, because the true horror was no longer the faceless figures standing before him. It was the uncertainty they had planted within him, the seed of doubt that would follow him wherever he went. The samurai stood trembling on the riverbank, staring into the distance. The figures were gone. The whispers had ceased. Yet the echo of their message remained, gnawing at his mind. The Noperabo did not need to kill him outright. They had already achieved their purpose. From this night forward, every face he saw could betray him, even the one he loved most. And that realization was a curse far more terrifying than death. The samurai's legs felt heavy as he forced himself away from the riverbank. The reeds whispered softly in the wind, though he could no longer tell if it was nature's voice or something still watching him. Behind him, the faceless figures had dissolved into the night, their presence gone as swiftly as it had appeared. Yet their absence gave no comfort. His hand hovered near the hilt of his sword as he walked the empty road back toward the city, every shadow stretching too long, every flicker of movement catching his eye. Faces passed him in the dark, merchants, travelers, neighbors, but each glance made his stomach knot. Was the smile genuine? Were the eyes real? Or were they masks, waiting to melt away if he dared to look too closely? When he reached home, the lantern by his door still burned faintly, a small beacon against the suffocating night. His wife opened the door at once, her face warm, her voice gentle, asking why he had returned so late. For a moment, his heart nearly broke in relief, but as she stepped closer, offering him the comfort he had longed for all evening, doubt clawed its way back into his chest. Her eyes shone in the lantern light. Her lips curved into a smile. Everything was familiar, yet that was the problem. Too familiar, too perfect. The samurai froze on the threshold, staring at the woman he had always trusted more than anyone else. His hand trembled as he reached for her, desperate to believe she was real. But in the stillness between them, he thought he saw the faintest shimmer across her features, as though the mask might slip at any moment. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He only stared, his heart torn between love and terror. And in that silence, one thought swallowed him whole. If the Noperabo had already taken her face once, how could he ever know if the woman standing before him was truly his wife, or only the ghost waiting for him to look too closely again? The tale of the Noperabo shows how terror can come from the familiar stripped bare, leaving us doubting the faces of even those we love. But not all spirits play with recognition. Some make themselves known in ways impossible to mistake, towering, relentless, and impossible to outrun. In Japan's countryside, whispers tell of a figure far too tall to be human, cloaked in white, her face hidden beneath a wide sun hat. She does not frighten with illusions or tricks. She frightens with inevitability. Once she chooses you, no charm, no prayer, no distance can keep her away. Her childlike voice echoes in the night, soft but inescapable, a sound that seals a victim's fate. This is the story of Hashaku-sama, the 8-foot-tall woman. 3 stories done, and 1 to go. I hope you like the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. If you'd like to sponsor my coffees for those nights, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, you don't have to. I truly enjoy making these videos for you. But if you'd like to, there's a link below the video. The story of Hashaku-sama begins with a boy, no older than 12, who had grown up in the safety of the city, but found himself spending a summer in the countryside. His parents had sent him to live for a few weeks with his grandparents, hoping he would enjoy the quiet rhythms of rural life, the sound of cicadas in the afternoon, the cool breeze that swept over the rice fields, the long evenings where the stars stretched across the sky. At first, he had welcomed the change. The air was cleaner, the nights darker, and everything seemed to move more slowly than the crowded streets of Tokyo. The village where his grandparents lived was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors exchanged greetings on the dirt roads, and where silence fell quickly after sunset. Their home sat at the edge of the fields, beyond which loomed a dark line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. His grandfather had told him on his first night never to wander too far, especially near the fields or the wooded roads after dusk. The boy laughed nervously, thinking it was only an old man's attempt to keep him out of trouble. But his grandmother's face, pale and drawn, betrayed no hint of humor. The days passed quietly. He helped with small chores, listened to the adults' stories, and explored the yard under the blazing summer Sunday. Yet the countryside had a way of unsettling him. The air carried strange sounds at night, the croak of frogs, the rustle of unseen animals, the low hum of insects that wove together into an eerie chorus. And though he tried to ignore it, he often felt the weight of being watched, especially when he lingered too close to the fields. It was on the third afternoon that it happened. The boy had been playing near the old stone wall that bordered the yard, stacking pebbles into a small tower when he heard it. A sound, soft but distinct, drifting over the tall stalks of rice. Po, po, po. He froze, the stones slipping from his hand. The sound was strange, childlike, almost playful, but stretched too long, hollow in a way that made his skin prickle. He stood on tiptoe, peering over the wall, but the fields rippled only with the wind. There was no one there. When he told his grandparents later, his grandfather's hands tightened around his pipe, his jaw clenched. His grandmother paled and muttered a prayer under her breath. They exchanged a look the boy could not decipher, a look heavy with fear. Finally, his grandfather told him sternly never to repeat what he had heard, never to answer if the sound came again, and above all, never to leave the house alone. The boy didn't understand. To him, it was just a strange noise, nothing more. But the way the old couple reacted, the trembling in his grandmother's hands, the way his grandfather's voice dropped low, as though the very walls might be listening, it unsettled him more than the sound itself. From that evening forward, the mood of the house changed. His grandparents grew quiet, their eyes darting often toward the fields, their prayers more frequent. The boy began to sense that something in the village was being kept from him, something everyone else already knew. And though he tried to sleep that night, the sound returned soft, distant, drifting in through the thin paper walls. Po, po, po. It was then he realized his summer in the countryside would not be the peaceful retreat his parents had promised. Something had noticed him. Something was waiting. The boy lay awake long after the lantern had been extinguished, staring at the faint outline of the wooden beams above him. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as it settled in the night. Yet no matter how he tried to steady his breathing, his ears strained for it, that sound he had heard before. The strange, childlike call that didn't belong to any bird or insect. At first, there was nothing, only the hum of cicadas outside, fading into the distance. His body began to relax, his eyes growing heavy. But then it came. Po, po, po. Faint, almost playful, drifting in from the direction of the fields. He sat up sharply, his pulse quickening. The sound was soft enough that he wondered if it was his imagination. He crept to the window, sliding the paper shoji open just enough to peek out. The night air carried the smell of wet earth and grass, cool against his skin. The moon hung above the fields, pale and full. At first the view was ordinary, just the stalks of rice swaying in the breeze. But then a shadow shifted, something tall, taller than any scarecrow, taller even than the trees beyond. It lingered at the edge of the field, unmoving, as though watching. His breath caught in his throat. He squinted, but the figure melted into the darkness before he could make out details. The boy stumbled back from the window, his small hands trembling. He wanted to call for his grandparents, but the words died in his throat. If he spoke too loudly, if he broke the silence, what if that thing heard him? The next morning he mentioned nothing. Yet his grandmother studied him over breakfast, her eyes narrowing as though she could see the fear in his face. When she asked if he had heard the sound again, he hesitated, then shook his head quickly. But his lie didn't convince her. She pressed a small charm into his palm, a folded paper talisman tied with thin red string. "Keep this with you," she whispered. "Do not drop it, no matter what you hear." The boy wanted to ask what it meant, but his grandfather cut him off with a stern look. "There are things in this village that do not belong to children. Do not ask questions." The words were meant to reassure him, but instead they filled him with dread. If the adults were too afraid to explain, then whatever haunted the fields was worse than he could imagine. Later that afternoon, while exploring the yard, the boy met another obstacle. A neighbor, an elderly woman bent over with age, leaned on the elderly fence and called to him. Her voice was soft, cracked, but her eyes were sharp as they scanned him. "You're the city boy, aren't you? Staying with the old couple?" He nodded timidly. Her expression grew grave. "Stay close to the house. Don't wander after sunset. And if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer." The warning struck him with unease. He hadn't told her about the sound, yet she seemed to know. Before he could ask, she shuffled away down the dirt path, muttering to herself. That night, the sound returned again, louder this time. Po, po, po. He pressed the charm tightly in his fist, whispering to himself that it was only the wind. But the sound drew closer, circling the house, slipping between the walls like smoke. He could almost feel it in the air around him, brushing against his skin. The boy crawled beneath his blanket, heart racing. He prayed for it to end, for his grandparents to walk in, for the morning sun to rise. Instead, the sound grew sharper, clearer, and then he froze. It was not just the sound anymore. It was his name, whispered softly, drawn out in a childlike tone. He clamped his hands over his ears, tears welling in his eyes. The charm dug into his palm. That was the first true complication. This was no distant echo, no harmless noise. Whatever lingered in the fields now knew his name. It was calling for him. And if he answered, he feared he would never come back. The boy barely slept after that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again, the soft, drawn-out po, po, po. And worse, the echo of his own name carried on the breeze. By morning, his face was pale, his body sluggish, but he said nothing. Fear made him swallow the truth. Yet his grandmother seemed to sense it anyway. She placed another charm by his bedside, this one heavier, drawn with strange black ink markings that looked older than the paper itself. She told him, in a trembling voice, to never, under any circumstance, let it fall from the window. Her hands shook as she set it down. "She only needs to see you once," she whispered. "Once, and she will never stop." The boy tried to ask who she was, but his grandfather interrupted, his tone harsh. "That is enough. He doesn't need to know." The argument between them unsettled him more than the warning itself. His grandmother's fear was raw and open, but his grandfather's silence carried its own weight. It was as if speaking too much of her would summon her closer. The boy sat quietly, caught between their conflicting voices, more confused than ever. That afternoon he wandered the yard, trying to convince himself everything was fine. The cicadas screamed in the trees. The fields swayed gently in the wind. Normal, ordinary, harmless. But as he traced the edge of the stone wall, he noticed something strange. The grass was bent flat in one long line, stretching from the fields straight toward the house, as if something enormous had passed through during the night. He crouched low, running his fingers along the crushed blades. His stomach tightened. Whatever had come this way hadn't been human. Later, as the sun began to dip, another character entered his story. A cousin, only a few years older, came to visit. She was bold and lively, teasing him for being so pale and quiet. When he admitted nervously that he thought someone had been calling his name at night, she laughed. "Probably just the wind," she said. "You're from the city. You're not used to countryside noises." Her confidence was almost enough to soothe him, but his grandmother grew furious at her words. "Don't joke about such things," she snapped, her voice sharper than he'd ever heard. "This is not a game. You must never take it lightly." The cousin rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath about silly superstitions, but her defiance only deepened the tension. The boy was caught again between two worlds, his cousin's mockery and his grandmother's terror. Which was the truth? Was it only his imagination, or something far darker than a child could understand? That night, the second strange event came. The boy awoke to the sound of tapping against the window. Not the gentle tap of a branch or the scuttle of an insect, but slow, deliberate knocks, 3 times. He lay frozen beneath his blanket, his hand gripping the charm his grandmother had given him. Then, faintly, came the sound again. Po, po, po. His throat tightened. He wanted to scream, but fear sealed his mouth shut. Then, soft and unmistakable, came his name, drawn out in a sing-song voice. He dared a glance toward the window. The charm still hung there, swaying faintly, but beyond the thin paper screen, he saw it, a shadow stretched impossibly tall, reaching nearly to the roof. The outline of a wide hat was visible, its brim drooping over where a face should have been. His breath caught. He couldn't see her eyes, but he felt them. A pressure, heavy and cold, pressed against his chest, pinning him in place. The voice came again, childlike and eerie. Po, po, po. Then, silence. The shadow vanished. By morning, the boy thought it might have been a dream, but when he looked, the charm on his window was torn, its paper frayed as if clawed by unseen fingers. His grandmother paled when she saw it, whispering prayers frantically. She replaced it with another, her hands trembling, but said nothing. His cousin, watching from the doorway, smirked faintly, as though still unconvinced. But the boy knew. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been imagination. Hashaku-sama had found him. And now she was closer. The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear. The boy felt it first in his sleep dreams, where the whisper of po, 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 drifted through endless rice fields, where a shadow taller than the trees loomed just beyond reach. Every morning he woke trembling, only to find fresh charms strung above his bed, in the windows, in the doorways. His grandmother prayed constantly, her voice hoarse from chanting. His grandfather stayed quiet, pacing the house at night with a candle and an old wooden stick clutched in his hand. The boy's cousin, who had once laughed at the warnings, stopped teasing him after she saw the shadow for herself. One night, as they huddled together in the same room, she shook him awake, her face pale. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. At first he didn't, but then, through the walls, the voice came again soft, childlike, playful. Po, po, po. The sound circled the house slowly, as though someone was walking around the walls, dragging the voice with them. Both children clung to each other, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. At one point, the cousin swore she saw a silhouette drift past the window, long white fabric brushing against the glass, the brim of a wide hat grazing the top. By morning, she said nothing, but her silence was its own admission. The tension reached its breaking point when the elders of the village arrived. 4 of them, dressed in plain robes, carrying bundles of salt, incense, and charms older than the boy had ever seen. They entered the house without a word, their faces grim, their steps deliberate. One by one, they placed charms in every corner, sprinkling salt in thick white lines along the thresholds. They lit incense and filled the air with smoke so dense the boy's eyes watered. The boy finally asked, his voice breaking, "What is happening? Why is she here?" The elders exchanged uneasy glances, as though no one wished to be the one to answer. Finally, the oldest among them spoke in a low voice. "Hashaku-sama has chosen you. Once she sees, she never forgets. She will wait at the edge of the fields, at the corners of your sight. She will call your name, and when you answer, she will take you." The words struck like a blade. The boy's cousin gasped, covering her mouth, while his grandmother broke into tears. His grandfather said nothing, only kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tight. The boy's chest tightened. He wanted to deny it, to insist it was all superstition, but the torn charm on his window, the towering shadow in the moonlight, the voice calling his name, he knew it was real. And now, to hear it spoken aloud, confirmed by the elders, shattered the last of his hope. The incense burned thick. The air buzzed with the muttering of prayers. The boy sat frozen in the center of the room, clutching the talisman in his hand so tightly the paper crumpled. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, impossibly tall, her face hidden in shadow, her voice playful and cruel. Then came the moment that changed everything. From outside, clear and sharp, the boy heard his mother's voice. She called his name, urgent and trembling, as though she had just arrived at the house. His heart leapt. His parents had come for him. They would take him back to the city, away from this nightmare. He scrambled to his feet, rushing toward the door. But before he could reach it, the oldest elder barked a command. "Stop! Do not answer! Do not open it!" The boy froze. "But it's my mother!" he cried. The elder shook his head. His eyes burned with grim certainty. "It is her voice, but it is not her. Once you open that door, you will never return." The cousin grabbed his arm, pulling him back, her own eyes wide with terror. The grandmother collapsed to her knees, praying louder, faster, as the voice outside repeated his name again and again, each call sharper, more desperate. The boy's heart twisted. It sounded exactly like her, every note, every breath, even the slight quiver in her tone. How could it not be real? Yet the elder's voice cut through his doubt. "Hashaku-sama mimics what you love most. That is how she takes you." The revelation reframed everything: the childlike voice, the playfulness, the persistence. She wasn't just a towering spirit wandering the fields. She was a hunter, clever and patient, wearing the sounds of loved ones to draw her prey closer. The boy stood trembling, torn between instinct and warning, as the voice outside called one last time, "Po! Po! Po!" And then silence. The room seemed to shiver, the incense smoke twisting unnaturally as if stirred by a presence they could not see. The elders' prayers grew louder, desperate, filling the air until the very walls of the house seemed to tremble. The boy clutched his charm, his mind racing with the unbearable question. Was that truly his mother at the door? Or had Hashaku-sama already stepped into his life, waiting for him to make one fatal mistake? The boy sat trembling on the tatami floor, the heavy air thick with incense and whispered prayers. Outside, the night had gone strangely quiet. Even the insects had stopped, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that pressed against the paper walls of the house. He clutched the talisman so tightly the paper had torn slightly, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. The elders did not relax. They moved from corner to corner, sprinkling more salt, replacing charms, chanting under their breath with voices that trembled only slightly from age. His grandmother remained on her knees, her lips moving faster and faster in prayer, while his grandfather stood rigid at the door, staring at it as though he expected it to shatter at any moment. The cousin hovered by the boy's side, gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. She no longer laughed at the warnings. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the door as though she too had heard the voice that was not a voice. Finally, one of the elders broke the silence, his voice low and heavy. "Now you see why we told you not to answer. She uses the ones you love. She wears their voices like masks. And once you step outside, there is no saving you." The boy's lips trembled, but it sounded just like her. The old man nodded grimly. "That is her way. She is not like the other spirits. She does not frighten you to chase you off. She frightens you so that when she calls, your heart is too confused to resist." The words reframed every moment of the last few days. The childlike call drifting from the fields, the shadow at the window, the torn charm. It had never been random. It had all been steps in the same process, first to be seen, then to be heard, then to be called. The boy understood now. It wasn't about chance. It was about being chosen. His grandmother finally spoke, her voice thin and shaking. "She has set her eyes on you. Once that happens, no prayer can make her forget. We can only delay her. Protect you for as long as we can." The boy's chest tightened. Delay, protect. None of these words meant escape. He had hoped the elders would have some cure, some hidden ritual that would banish the towering figure forever. Instead, all he heard was inevitability. Another elder knelt beside him, his hands surprisingly firm as they adjusted the talisman in his grip. "Do not let go of this, ever. It is not strong enough to stop her, but it is strong enough to slow her. As long as you hold it, she cannot touch you directly. But charms fade, paper tears. She will wait until one slips, and then she will come." The cousin shivered, pulling closer to him. "Then what do we do? We can't just sit here forever." The elder's gaze was dark, resigned. "That is all we have ever done." The boy swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wanted to demand answers, to scream at them for hiding this secret, for letting him play in the yard, for waiting until it was too late. But fear held his tongue, and deep down, he knew it would not have mattered. Once she had seen him, nothing else mattered. Another whisper came, faint this time, from beyond the house. It wasn't the childlike, Po, po, po. Now, it was his own voice. The boy froze, his skin crawling. It echoed softly, perfectly, repeating words he had spoken earlier that evening to his cousin. "I'll be fine. Don't worry." The faceless mimicry carried no warmth, no soul, just hollow repetition that seeped through the walls like dampness. The cousin gasped and covered her ears. The grandmother began to cry softly, rocking back and forth. The elders redoubled their chanting, sprinkling more salt until it formed thick white lines around the boy where he, Saturday. The revelation burned in his mind like fire. Hashaku-sama didn't just mimic loved ones, she mimicked him. She could use his own words, his own voice, against the ones he cared about. If she could do this now, what would stop her from calling to his parents back in the city, from tricking them into opening a door or stepping outside, thinking their son was calling for help? The boy's small hands shook violently as he pressed the talisman to his chest. His world had shifted. The monster wasn't just outside the house anymore. She was inside every sound, every memory, every word that could be twisted. And though the prayers and charms held her back for now, the boy finally understood the truth the villagers had always known. Hashaku-sama could be delayed, resisted, warded off for nights or even years, but never escaped. Once she had seen you, the countdown had already begun. The boy did not sleep that night. He sat in the circle of salt with the talisman clutched tight against his chest, staring at the shoji door that separated him from the darkness outside. The elders prayed until their voices cracked. Incense burned down to ash, and the house filled with smoke so thick it stung his eyes. Still, he waited for the sound, for the voice, for her. But the night passed in silence. By dawn, the elders gathered their things and left with grim faces, offering no comfort. His grandmother embraced him tightly, whispering prayers into his hair, while his grandfather kept his gaze fixed on the floor. No one told him what would happen next. No one said he was safe. That morning, his cousin tried to smile, but it faltered. "See? Nothing happened," she said softly. Yet her eyes betrayed the truth. They all knew it wasn't over. The boy stood in the yard, staring at the fields. The breeze moved the rice stalks gently, their tips whispering against each other like countless voices too far to hear clearly. He thought he saw movement, a figure tall and white, a brimmed hat rising above the stalks, but when he blinked, it was gone. His grandparents began packing his things, saying only that he would return to the city soon. The village was no longer safe for him. But deep down, the boy understood the horror his grandmother's silence carried. It didn't matter where he went. That night, long after he had been tucked into bed, he heard it again, faint, patient, po, po, po. And this time, the voice came not from the fields, not from the road, not from beyond the window. It came from inside the house. He pulled the blanket over his head, clutching the talisman with all the strength he had left. But one thought consumed him, burning hotter than his fear. If no one had ever escaped her, how much longer did he have before Hashaku-sama finally stepped through the door? I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story about a ghost that is still alive, according to the old inhabitants of Indonesia. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.